There is a particular kind of loneliness that does not announce itself. It does not arrive during tragedy or loss. It does not come when something breaks. It settles in quietly in the middle of a conversation that should feel normal, in the pause after you say something and the room just moves on. You have experienced it, maybe more times than you care to count. You say something, you meant it carefully. You chose the words deliberately, and the response you get back makes you realize, not rudely, not with any drama, that something did not translate. That what landed in the air between you and another person was not what you intended to send. Most people assume loneliness is about having no one around, but there is a version of it that happens in full rooms, around people who like you, around people who are trying. It happens when the way your mind works makes you a permanent slight foreigner in every conversation, not alien enough to be obvious, just different enough to feel the distance. And the most exhausting part is that you have learned to appear fine. You have learned to close the gap. You smile at the right moments. You let things pass. You translate yourself in real time constantly so that others do not have to feel the discomfort of not following you. The question is not whether you are misunderstood. The question is, what has that done to you? He had always been the kind of person who read the ending first. Not the last page of a book, he never needed to do that. He meant something more general. He saw how conversations would end before they began. He understood what people actually wanted from an exchange, often before they did. He noticed the contradiction in a well-meaning argument within seconds, while the person making it was still gathering momentum. He was not arrogant about it. That is important to understand. He was not sitting in judgment, waiting for others to catch up. He was not performing intelligence. He was simply wired this way, had been since childhood. He saw the world in faster, deeper frames than most, and for a long time he believed this was a gift with only benefits. He worked in a mid-sized company, competent colleagues, reasonable work environment. He was well regarded. People respected his analysis. When a problem needed real thinking, he was the person they came to. But in the day-to-day, in the ordinary rhythm of office life, he felt something he had trouble naming. It was not boredom exactly. It was not frustration. It was closer to the feeling of being slightly out of phase with everything, like watching the same film as everyone else but at a different frame rate. He would join a lunch conversation about something trivial and find himself unable to engage with the surface of it. Not because he thought the topic was beneath him. He genuinely did not feel that, but because his mind would immediately go deeper, would begin turning it over, would notice layers, implications, patterns. And by the time everyone else was still at the surface, he was somewhere else entirely. He tried to come back. He tried to meet people where they were, and often he succeeded. He could laugh at the right moments. He could track the small talk without visibly struggling, but it cost him something. By the end of most social days, he felt a specific kind of tired. Not the tired of having worked hard. The tired of having performed a version of himself that fit slightly smaller than his actual size. At home, he read, he thought. He wrote in notebooks that no one ever saw. This was when he felt most like himself, when there was no one to translate for, no gap to quietly bridge. He did not consider himself unhappy. He had good things in his life, but there was a question he never asked out loud, never even fully formed in words. Why does it take so much effort to simply be understood? One part of him said, "You chose this. You could simplify, you could stay at the surface. Other people do it effortlessly. Other people do not carry every conversation into depths no one asked for. You could choose to meet the moment as it is without turning it into something larger. And there was truth in that voice. He knew it. The choice to engage deeply with everything was, in some sense, a choice. Or at least it felt like something he could theoretically switch off, a dial he could turn down if he really wanted to. But another part of him answered, and then what? If you hollow yourself out to fit, what exactly are you fitting into? If you sand down everything that makes you the way you are so the conversation is smoother, are you connecting, or are you just performing connection? Is that closeness, or is it a more comfortable kind of alone? That was the real question, and it was not comfortable. The first voice came back quieter this time, but no less firm. It said, "Your need to be understood is ego dressed as loneliness. Not everyone needs to follow your mind to its furthest corners. That expectation is your burden to carry, not theirs. Other people are not failing you. You are just asking for something most people were never equipped to give." He sat with that for a long time, because there was something in it he could not easily dismiss. The expectation of being met fully, was that reasonable? Was that something you could ask of another person? Or was it a kind of entitlement wrapped in the language of emotional need? The second voice said, "It is not entitlement, it is just loneliness. And loneliness is not a personality flaw. Wanting to be known is not the same as demanding perfection from another person. You are not asking to be worshipped. You are asking to be followed just once, all the way to where you actually live." Neither voice won. They rarely do. He went to sleep, and in the morning the same tension was there, quiet and patient, waiting exactly where he had left it. He had built explanations for all of it, careful, reasonable ones. The distance he felt was just the nature of his personality. He was an introvert. He needed more alone time than most people. That was simply how he was made, the wiring, not a wound. The fact that real connection felt rare was normal for someone like him. He had read enough about personality to know this. He had the vocabulary for it. That vocabulary had become a kind of shelter. He told himself this often enough that it settled into something like belief. And belief, once it hardens, stops asking for evidence. It simply becomes the ground you stand on. He also told himself that other people were not truly interested in what he had to offer. That depth made people uncomfortable. That intelligence, when it moves faster than the room, tends to create friction rather than warmth. And so it was not a failure of connection, it was just an incompatibility of operating speeds. A structural thing, nobody's fault, just the way the numbers fell. There was a logic to all of this. It held together well. The pieces fit. And because the pieces fit, he rarely looked for the ones that didn't. Because when he looked carefully, really carefully, there were moments when someone had reached toward him and he had not reached back, not out of coldness, but out of something quieter than that. The habit of assuming the connection would not go deep enough to be worth the full effort. The habit of offering a partial version of himself, enough to be polite, not enough to be vulnerable, and then noting privately that the conversation had not gone anywhere interesting. It was easier to conclude that people did not understand him than to ask whether he had given them anything real to understand. He would not have called this self-deception. It was more subtle than that. It was a narrative that was partially true, which made it nearly impossible to question. Partial truths are the best hiding places. They require no maintenance. They already look like honesty. He had also begun to carry something that looked like pride but felt, underneath, like grief. a certain hardening around the idea that his inner life was simply a place others could not enter. Not because he was cold, he was not, but because the entrances had slowly become narrower, and then narrower still, until they were barely visible even to him. This belief protected him from something specific, the vulnerability of trying fully and still not being met. If connection was structurally impossible, if the gap was a matter of architecture rather than effort, then its absence was not rejection. It was not a comment on his worth. It was just physics. Comfortable, impersonal, blameless physics. But protection always comes with a cost. And the cost was that he had stopped being able to tell the difference between a door that was truly locked and one he had quietly shut himself. Nietzsche wrote about those who climb to heights and find the air thinner. He did not mean this as a celebration of isolation. He meant something more uncomfortable, that those who think beyond the common frame often pay for it with a specific kind of suffering. Not because the world is cruel to them, but because the distance between a rare way of seeing and the ordinary rhythm of life is genuinely difficult to cross in either direction. There is a concept in Nietzsche's thinking that rarely gets mentioned alongside intelligence: the danger of the heights. Not just the difficulty of being up there, but what that difficulty can quietly do to a person over time. The person who sees further, thinks faster, moves through ideas with ease. This person faces a real temptation. The temptation to stop building bridges, to let the gap become identity, to transform what is genuinely painful, the difficulty of connection, into a defining feature, a source of quiet meaning. Even in its worst form, a kind of superiority that does not call itself superiority. Nietzsche called this in various forms a life-denying stance, a way of organizing yourself around what you cannot have, rather than moving through the difficulty toward what might still be possible. Not because the pain is fake, but because the pain over time becomes something you begin to need, because it confirms the story, and the story has become how you know who you are. There is another thread worth pulling. Nietzsche was deeply suspicious of self-knowledge, not because he thought introspection was useless, but because he observed that human beings are remarkably skilled at constructing narratives that protect us from what we most need to see. We do not simply discover who we are. We build a version of ourselves that makes sense of our history, our wounds, our patterns, and then we inhabit that version as though it were simply the truth. For someone who thinks with precision and depth about the external world, this is a quiet irony worth sitting with. The very intelligence that allows you to see through other people's self-deceptions, to notice the rationalizations, the convenient blind spots, the stories people tell themselves, does not automatically grant you immunity from your own. The internal narrative, "I am simply too much for most people," connection at this level is structurally unavailable to me. The loneliness is just the price of being wired this way, may be just as much a construction as any other self-story. Careful, internally consistent, partially true, and very convenient. Not a verdict, just a lens, a quiet one, but a lens that once placed shifts something. He thought about a conversation he had dismissed, maybe 6 months ago. A colleague had stayed after a meeting and asked him something genuinely curious. Not small talk, a real question about how he approached a particular kind of problem, how he decided when to trust his first instinct and when to push past it. It was a question that, had he let it, could have gone somewhere. He had answered it but briefly, 2 sentences, maybe 3. He had assumed, in the way he always assumed, that the conversation would not go anywhere worth the energy, that the question was polite curiosity, not real interest. He had closed it down before it had the chance to open. He had forgotten about it almost immediately. But now it came back, and he held it differently. He noticed something he had not let himself notice at the time. He had made a decision that day that he had dressed up as an observation. He had decided the conversation would be shallow before it had a chance to prove otherwise, and then he had ensured it was shallow by not offering anything deeper, and then he had walked away having confirmed, once again, that conversations with most people tend not to go anywhere. The logic was airtight, and he had been the one who sealed it. This was not stupidity. It is almost never stupidity for people who think this way. It is something more precise than that, the use of a very capable mind to construct narratives that are internally consistent, emotionally protective, and genuinely hard to falsify. The smarter you are, the more seamlessly you can make your self-deceptions hold together. Intelligence is not a guard against this. In some ways, it makes the construction more convincing to yourself most of all. The isolation was real, the longing for understanding was real, but the story built around them, that story had begun to operate independently of what was actually happening. It had its own momentum, it confirmed itself. And so he had stopped noticing the moments that didn't fit, the hands extended that he had quietly left hanging. And beneath the story, beneath all of it, there was something simpler, something he had been carefully not looking at for a long time. The fear that even if he tried fully, even if he opened all the way, it still would not be enough. That the gap was not circumstantial, not a matter of finding the right person or the right moment, but something fundamental, a permanent condition, a sentence, not a season. He had made that fear into a theorem, proved it to himself repeatedly with evidence he had quietly selected and evidence he had quietly ignored. And a theorem, once proved to your own satisfaction, does not need to be revisited. It just runs in the background, shaping every decision, every retreat, every preemptive withdrawal invisible, because it no longer needs to announce itself. That fear was the thing the narrative was built to protect him from feeling. There is a difference between being misunderstood and being unwilling to be known. These can look identical from the outside. They can even feel identical from the inside. The experience of not being reached is the same either way. But they are not the same thing, and the difference matters not as a moral judgment, but as a simple, uncomfortable fact. Being misunderstood is something that happens to you. It is the experience of extending yourself, of trying to make genuine contact, and finding that the other person cannot or will not meet you there. It is a real experience. It is painful. And it happens to people who think quickly and deeply more than it happens to others. That part is true. Being unwilling to be known is something you do, not loudly, not consciously most of the time. It happens gradually, reasonably, with very good justifications accumulated over many years. Each small withdrawal makes sense on its own. Each preemptive retreat is defensible. And by the time you look back, you have traveled a long distance from the place where someone could actually find you. For someone who processes the world with speed and depth, the retreat into isolation can feel like a natural consequence of how they are made. And in some ways it is. The difficulty is real. The exhaustion of constant translation is real. The specific grief of moving through rooms where no one quite follows you, that is not invented. But somewhere along the way, the difficulty became a conclusion. The exhaustion became evidence of something permanent. And once something becomes evidence, it stops being questioned. It becomes the foundation the rest of the story is built on. The ache for connection does not disappear when you stop reaching for it. It does not go quiet out of acceptance. It gets quieter out of something closer to defeat gradually over time until it becomes simply the texture of things, a kind of baseline hum, the mild, unnamed, accepted distance that you have stopped calling loneliness because you have stopped remembering what the alternative felt like. That is not peace. That is just accommodation with a calm face. And maybe this is the part that is hardest to sit with. Maybe the most precise mind in the room is also capable of constructing the most precise loneliness. Not because the world failed, not because connection was truly impossible, but because that mind found a way to make the failure feel inevitable, and inevitability, once believed, requires no further examination. Being highly intelligent does not make you hard to understand. It makes it very easy to construct reasons not to be known. The gap is real, but some of it, not all, but some, you built yourself, and you built it well. It is, for many people who move through the world this way. The difficulty of existing at a different frequency than most, that is not imagined. The exhaustion of translating yourself in real time, of watching conversations drift past the depth you actually live at, all of it is real. But real difficulty and permanent impossibility are not the same thing. They feel the same when you are inside them long enough, but they are not. What shifts when you hold this carefully is not the intelligence. That stays. The mind stays exactly as it is. What shifts is the relationship to the story that has formed around it, the story that made isolation a fact rather than a pattern, that made the wall look like a window, that made withdrawal feel like wisdom. There is a kind of courage that has nothing to do with being louder or more visible. It is quieter than that. It is the courage of extending yourself without certainty, of beginning a conversation without knowing how far it will go, of offering something real before you know whether it will land. You do not have to be fully understood to be genuinely met. Those are not the same thing either. And maybe the question worth sitting with, not solving, not resolving, just sitting with, is whether you have been waiting to be understood, or whether you have been, in your own quiet and very intelligent way, making sure you would not be. No one needs to answer that out loud. It belongs to you.